I'm not a PC person, so you'll have to forgive me my PC bumbles. I'm just curious, just for starters, what your thoughts are on why mindfulness might be useful to you and what you do, whether it's personally or professionally in your work. So what's brought you to want to learn more about this? It's not mandatory, everything's invitational. So I'm just curious if anyone wants to share why they're here, what this is meaning to you.
I have a mental health focus, so I think that this will be very beneficial in practice, as well as self-care.
Yes, okay, so you have I'm repeating back because, yeah, okay, just so I don't sound like a parrot. So you have a mental health focus, and you also feel like this might be important for self-care. As a mental health person, I echo that sentiment, and I think it can be very useful in our work. Other folks? Oh, good.
Maybe because there are so many things on my mind, and instead of thinking about all things together, maybe I can focus on only one thing and then have some peace with that instead of just keep interrupting my thinking process. So I just do, if there's some other way, I can just clear out my thinking for each different area and then have some a little bit more peaceful. When I'm just working on and thinking something different, instead of doing that, just kind of more focused. That's how I just this terminology comes to my mind that way.
Okay, I'm going to paraphrase that. But it sounds as though what you're saying is you have a very busy mind, it's very active, you think a lot of things simultaneously, and you're hoping to find skills so that you can focus a little bit more. And in the Buddhist tradition, it's called monkey mind, which I think is kind of funny. I laugh at it because I think I have a lot of monkeys. I don't just have a single monkey, but I have a whole troop in my head. So yeah, finding ways to try to harness the thoughts and challenge them and focus them or channel them and focus them so that we don't feel so distracted mentally. Yeah, great. Other thoughts?
Now that I'm retired, I've taken on the role of teaching doctoring skills to the neurology residents. And I'm finding that there is a big gap between my level of, or my chronologic level of profession and the residents. And I am constantly looking into new ways of better communicating with the residents so that I can teach them or demonstrate better ways of managing situations, because we deal with things like breaking bad news, bias, conflict, and things like that. So I'm always interested in new ideas.
Okay, great. So being interested in new ideas, particularly in the realm of communication, bridging generational gaps in training and understanding, and trying to help people cope with what could be in their professional world, difficult and stressing aspects of their profession. Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts?
I practiced meditation for 2 years and I've gotten away from it. And I want to get back. And I know how helpful it can be to relieve stress and a host of other health benefits and mental benefits. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, so hoping to get back into a meditation practice because you understand its benefits from your own lived experience. Great. Okay, any others? Wonderful. I'm going to preface this by saying that everything we do here is invitational. So when I ask questions or when I invite you to practice or try something, please see it as an invitation. You're never required to do anything. And if you decide to sit it out, doodle, do something else, don't worry about hurting my feelings. I'm a big believer that all of these things are invitational, and it's important for you to take care of yourself and do what feels best for you. Okay. So in terms of thinking about what mindfulness is, I have a fairly, well, there are two ways to define it. I'll start with a very simple one. And the way I see it is mindfulness is a way of being in relationship with ourselves and with other people in the world. So it's how we are in the world. But it's also an intention to pay attention to what our experience is in the moment. So what am I going through right now? And also to pay attention to how we are impacting others, so how we're relating to other people. And ultimately, I think the overlay of all of this is to try to do so with as much kindness and self-compassion and understanding as we possibly can. I think in my work in the field, and I've worked in a lot of different capacities, as Margaret mentioned, one of the things I've noticed is that when people begin to pay attention and be more mindful of their experience, they start noticing how mindless they are. You know, we start noticing that our mind is running amok. We start noticing that physiologically we're aroused all the time, like we're on 10 cups of coffee. And so often what happens when we start paying attention to our experience is we start noticing a lot of things that we're not typically fond of seeing. We also may notice a lot of our strengths and a lot of places where we're resilient. But the reason why I think the kindness piece is important is that we will encounter bumps in the road. We will encounter things about ourselves that we may not necessarily like. But if we can hold that with an attitude of kindness, rather than using mindfulness as one more achievement orientation, one more thing to, whack ourselves over the head if we're not doing it right, I think that the journey can be a little bit more kind. I say this because when I started out doing meditation many years ago, I started in the Soto Zen tradition. And the Soto Zen tradition throws you right off the chute, sitting and staring at a wall for 45 minutes and you're not supposed to move. And I was really determined that I was going to be the best meditator ever. And I drove myself completely insane. And after 2 years of deciding that I was going to be the best meditator ever, I realized it wasn't in my best interest. And part of that was because my focus was on being a good meditator, not on the experience of what was happening when I was meditating. So I offer that story because if you are at the beginning or somewhere along the path, it's not, being mindful is not a slam dunk. It's not an achievement. I call it, as a scientist, a nonlinear progression. So it goes like this. Sometimes you may not practice at all. Sometimes you may be immersed in your practice. But it's really a way of being. And that, I think, is the most important part of this, is just how you are in the world. Does that make sense? And by the way, feel free to ask questions at any time. So quickly, just to give due diligence to this concept, I wanted to quickly review some of the benefits of mindfulness from the research. And these are pretty much the latest systematic reviews or meta-analyses of what the benefits are of mindfulness. You can read these for yourself, but basically some mindfulness-based interventions are effective for reducing symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. So for those of you that are working with humans, these are pretty much ubiquitous things that we run into every day and often in our own lives. We're starting to see more now that mindfulness-based practices and systems in workplaces can be beneficial for reducing workplace stress. If you want any of these, you will get the slides, so if you want to have more detail. One that I think is particularly important in healthcare systems and education, which are places that I work, is that mindfulness interventions are starting to help reduce employee burnout, as well as distress, anxiety, and depression. So particularly, I do a lot of work in schools and school systems, and burnout is one of the most prevalent issues that we're facing in the schools. And I know that that's also the case in medicine and various disciplines that you are occupying, social work, anything in mental health. So that's encouraging. Leadership. So we're starting to see in studies of leaders that managers are reporting more well-being and resilience and improved leadership skills. So this is something I think that relates a lot to what you're doing, Jerry, and thinking about how can we cultivate leaders. And I don't know if this is universally around communication, around supporting people in leadership, but I think that that's something that we're seeing. And then the mental health of health workers. So those of you who work with folks with any mental health issues, what we take on can be tremendously burdensome for them, for us. And so some of the studies are showing that it can be beneficial for mental health folks as well, and people working in health. So this is a model that I developed in my book, which I think Jerry's probably already introduced you to, or not? Yes, okay. And it's basically called the BREATHE model. One of the reasons that the acronym BREATHE is so meaningful is that from my perspective, breathing is one of the few things that we all have access to in some way, shape, or form that we can use that is relatively free and accessible. But in this model, there are 7 different components. The first is breath awareness. And so the ones in blue are the ones we'll be focusing on today. So just paying attention to Am I holding my breath while I'm talking to you? Am I holding my breath while I'm interacting with a colleague or interacting with a client, interacting with a patient? What does that look like? Regulation via intentional breathing, and we're going to explore that in more detail today. Experiencing emotion, I think, is really important because many of us, particularly in professions where we have to have a frame around what we do, or we can't be, constant sponges of people's experience, we learn to repress our emotion and we learn to suppress our emotion. We can disconnect from our emotional lives and our emotional experiences, in part because of how we're trained, but in part because we need to not be absorbing everything that comes at us. And so one of the unfortunate byproducts is that we become less in touch with our emotion. And can we experience our emotions without being completely overcome by them? Adjusting mindsets or stories, and this is something we'll touch on briefly today, but your mind has a huge relationship to your experience, and what you think and how you think about yourself and others can strongly determine what your experience is of yourself and others. Taking a purposeful pause, which I think is a gigantic overlay for all of this work. So if we're going at life 100 miles an hour without a break, it's really hard to be mindful. We can't stop and be aware of our experience if we're constantly on the go. And, personally and as a culture, I think that we're so used to being busy, we're tethered to our devices, we're always getting input, then it really requires an intention to pause rather than just saying, I'll pause. It needs to be an intentional act. Humor, I put this in for a very good reason. I think that, for those of us who work with others at all, regardless of your capacity, if we aren't able to take things lightly that are, things that we can take lightly, obviously not everything is funny, but to be able to find the humor and find the joy and find the play where we can in our lives is incredibly important, particularly for our nervous systems. Laughter is a great release. And last but not least, really making a commitment to engage each other mindfully. And I think that this is something I'm springing off of in my own work and hopefully my writing. In this day and age, it feels really as though we're becoming much more mindless in our engagement with others. You see it a lot on social media, you see it in the media, you see it in leadership, you see it in a lot of different places. And part of that is because our nervous systems are so saturated with information that we're just very quickly responding and reacting, but we're not engaging each other mindfully. Any questions about that? Pretty self-explanatory, hopefully. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about stress. And I'm sure that, by virtue of the fact that you all work in some capacity in a health center, stress is probably not something that you're not familiar with in some way, shape, or form. The reason why I like to talk about stress, there's several reasons. One, I think stress gets a bad rap. So even hearing the word stress stresses a lot of people out. As soon as we think of stress, we think of it as bad. And in fact, stress in and of itself isn't bad. So there are different kinds of stress. One of them is called eustress. Is anyone familiar with that term? Okay. So eustress is the stress that you experience when you decide to come and talk in front of a group of people that you don't know. So it's inherently stressful because it's new. Or if you decide I'm going to get on the back of a motorcycle, or you decide I think I'm going to try bungee jumping, or I think I'm going to try to do something that's outside of my normal repertoire. Stress in and of itself isn't bad, but when we try new things, we often find them stressful at some level. And that's an opportunity for growth. So that is stress that pushes us outside our comfort zone, hopefully in a healthy way. So that's called eustress. On the other end of the coin is distress. So distress is the stuff that makes us feel sick to our stomach. It's the stuff that makes us feel unhealthy. It's the stuff that makes us want to go seek out, something to soothe the stress, whether it be working out, whether it be a pint of ice cream, whether it's half a bottle of wine, whatever your thing is, it's always comes back to the wine. But distress is when we have that feeling, it leads to muscle tension, it leads to chronic headaches, it leads to pain. So distress is something to pay attention to, particularly when it's chronic. So all of you are in some capacity in healthcare. I don't have to explain to you the effects of chronic stress. You all know this very well from your work. Basically, the upshot is that chronic stress is associated with systemic inflammation. And you pick your system. It could be your musculature, it could be your gut, it could be your brain. But when we're chronically stressed, the body is primed and pumping out lots of different substances, as you all know, to try to cope with that stress. And what it inevitably does is it starts breaking systems down. So chronic stress is very destructive. It's also very destructive to our psychology because, believe it or not, we were not wired to be under stress all the time. Our nervous systems just are not capable of dealing with that. And that's why I think, for those of us in the mental health field especially, but also in any discipline, you're running into people with much higher levels of things like depression and anxiety, whether they're, subsyndromal, subclinical, or clinical. We're seeing a lot of distress because people are so saturated environmentally. Does that make sense? Okay. So here are just some of the impacts of chronic stress. And again, I'm sure this is very familiar to all of you, but the systemic inflammation that we experience affects every system in the body, from the immune system to the GI system, musculoskeletal chain, endocrine dysfunction, etc. And so this is basically the interpersonal level. So this is what you see in the clinic, how it affects the individual. But in my work, and for those of you that are working at all in mental health, what you'll also start experiencing is that chronic stress really does affect interpersonal relationships. And part of the reason that I wrote my book was to draw attention to the fact that relationships are essential for our survival. And if we are dealing with chronic states of unmanaged stress that impact our relationships, we're also jeopardizing our very survival. And it's important that we, did we lose this? It's still going. It's important that we take responsibility for our stress and begin to learn what I would like to think fairly simple but somewhat profound tools for trying to help manage stress in our daily lives. But as you can see from this slide, the effects of stress are really ubiquitous. And even though you may not be someone who is prone, say, to GI distress or prone to respiratory problems, even if you are young enough that it has not, done years worth of chronic, and looking at someone in medical school, hopefully, you're not there. But yeah, I mean, this stuff does take an accumulative effect. And particularly when we work with people, it's important to be mindful of the fact that it does affect our relationships. And even though we may be the consummate professionals and think we can compartmentalize our life stress and be beautiful and mindful with the people we work with, that's not always the case. And, the research shows that we're much more receptive to nonverbal cues than verbal cues. So even if I'm standing up here being, Little Miss Sunshine, if I'm projecting out a whole lot of things through my nonverbal behavior, you will pick up on it. So it's important to attend to that part of ourselves in order to do the work that we do. Is that good? Okay. This is probably a slide you've seen 8 million times for those of you in any kind of medical profession. So just a really brief discussion of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is incredibly important when considering stress because it is probably most sensitive to it. And we hear a lot of analogies in the non-medical world about the sympathetic nervous system, which is the gas pedal, bad, right? And the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest and repair, brake pedal, good. So it seems like out in the world, fight, flight, freeze seems to be evil, and rest and digest seems to be the pinnacle of what we're all trying to be like. And in reality, if we didn't have that sympathetic nervous system response, we'd probably be dead because we would not be able to respond to the challenges of life. And if we didn't have the parasympathetic nervous system response, we'd probably also not be doing so well because we wouldn't be able to rest and digest and repair after our busy, stressful days. So the importance of this is that really we need both on board in order to be functional. but it's more of a balance than trying to suppress sympathetic nervous system in lieu of relaxation. But what we do see in our culture in particular is we're what we call sympathetic nervous system dominant. So it's kind of like driving a stick shift car with the gas pedal down all the time and the gear in neutral. And, you know, if you look at your tachometer and it's like way, way high, that's how a lot of us live our lives. And so it's important to put the clutch on, which is kind of the opposite, and create a little bit more balance and figure out how to work that system in a way that's most effective. Does anybody know, this is a crazy question for this crowd, but does anybody know which autonomic nervous system function, because they're basically automatic as well as autonomic, does anyone know which function we can actually willfully control? There's one.
Which action?
There's one part of our autonomic nervous system that we can actually, there's one function. Breathing. Yes, breathing. Yeah. So breathing is the one way that we can alter our autonomic nervous system function. If we breathe quickly, if I had you all hyperventilate, which I won't, you'd probably notice in a short amount of time that your whole nervous system would start getting jangly and upregulated. And when we work a little bit on downregulating breathing, you'll notice that you can use your breath to downregulate your nervous system. And it's the only autonomic function, but it is super cool. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is incredibly super simple. I apologize to the neurologist in the room who probably hates looking at blobs of brain like this, but this is kind of a useful teaching heuristic. The brain in a very simplistic way is divided into 3 gross states, and I mean gross as in this is not very precise. But there's the I am state, which is the brain stem, and it's like survival. And that is the one if you need to slam the brakes on, if a squirrel, well, this is me, I brake for squirrels. If there's a squirrel running in front of my car, I will slam the brakes on, and that survival system is stopping me. The I feel state, which is the limbic system, and that's the part of the brain. And again, all of this is diffuse neural networks. This is super simple, but the midbrain is, you know, the I feel, my experience, and the prefrontal cortex, which gets a lot of attention now, particularly in the mindfulness world, is I think, I regulate, I communicate effectively, I problem solve, I listen. And the reason why this is important is that when we're in states of chronic stress, we engage in what's called bottom-up processing. And again, a fairly simple model, but we take information from the body, and that information tends to suppress what goes on in here. So if you think about when I'm super stressed, I have a really hard time thinking. If I stressed you out and gave you a math problem that you could do in other times, it might be harder for you. And vice versa, when we are in states of relative calm, this system tends to suppress, to some extent, the systems. And I don't want to make it sound like feelings are bad or survival is bad. That's not the message. But the kind of like the intense thoughts, feelings, emotions, the running ruminative thoughts, those types of things. When we're dealing from a place of calm, this thinking center has more of a capacity to stop and say, oh, well, wait a minute. You know, am I just thinking excessively? And you can pay attention to thinking excessively. But if you're getting flooded from information from the body, or if you're getting flooded from information or with information that the world is not safe, then it becomes really, really difficult to regulate. It becomes really difficult to deal with emotional experience in a way that's balanced. Okay, so when we're not attending to the nervous system, it makes it very difficult for us to be able to be present. You know, we're talking about communication, we're talking about interprofessional discourse. It's really hard to do that if we're always dealing with survival messages. If you're only dealing with the level of, I just got to get through my day, man. You know, anyone been there? Mm-hmm. It's really hard to be your best self and to communicate from a place that is solid and grounded. And that's why, again, our task is not to suppress, and I hear this language a lot, you know, amygdala is bad, amygdala hijack, your emotional expression is negative, you know, so there's a lot of language in the mindfulness world about wanting to suppress those parts of ourselves. But it's not really about suppressing, it's finding a way to make peace with them so that we can be in a world that's in a way that's integrated. So if I don't have any emotion, my life wouldn't be all that much fun. If I didn't have any survival drive, I would be dead. And so there is a way for all of these things to coexist peacefully, but if we don't regulate, then we can't even begin to entertain how it is to balance those parts of ourselves. Does that make sense? Okay. So how does this work in relationship? Is anyone familiar with the work of John Gottman? Anyone heard? Yeah, okay. So, I love John Gottman. I think he's super cool. John Gottman's work inspired me a lot. He did a lot of cross work with Oregon Social Learning Center when I was there. And John Gottman's research really looks a lot at interpersonal relationships and the types of behaviors that we get into, particularly with our spouses and close others. And so, you know, his research shows that things like defensiveness and resentment and rejection and stonewalling and things like that tend to predict poor outcomes in our relationships. The part of his research that I thought was fascinating and was one of the cornerstones of my book was research that he did in what's called the Love Lab. Has anyone heard of the Love Lab? Yeah, that's cool. So in Seattle, they got this apartment and they wired it up with cameras. And they had couples come in for a couple of days, and they could bring their dogs, and they could bring their computers, and they could bring their newspapers. And they hung out for a couple of days, and they monitored their, they did galvanic skin response, and they monitored their physiology, basically heart rate, respiration. And what they found was that when couples were engaging in, interacting or communicating, if their heart rate, and this is for average people, not elite athletes, just FYI, but when most people's heart rate exceeded 100 beats per minute, it also was directly associated with a gigantic decrement in their interpersonal skill. So when people's heart rate got too elevated, they had a really hard time communicating effectively. And ultimately, that in some cases, some studies predicted not good marriage outcomes. But what was fascinating, I thought, was that if my heart's racing, and I can feel my heart racing, and I can sense my heart racing, and I know something's going on in my body, and I know that there's a good chance that means what's going on up here is probably not great, or at least not, this is not the place where my heart's racing, like, honey, I think we need to talk about the finances today. So it gives you a sense that there are things that need to be regulated before you communicate, which ties us back to the breath, because the breath is one of the fastest and I think most accessible for most people, outside of respiratory disease. The breath for most people is an accessible way for us to learn how to regulate our physiology. And in regulating our physiology, hopefully, now again, this is not a 100% probability event. If we don't communicate well when we're calm, we're probably not going to magically communicate well just because our heart rate's down. But we have a much better likelihood of not being flooded from bottom-up information from the body. We don't feel like everything's a survival battle. Our emotions are not running rampant, and we have some capacity to make intelligent choices about how we respond to people. Again, it's not a magic pill, but it increases the likelihood. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any questions about that? No? Okay. So I'm going to give you a second to read this. Is anyone familiar with the window of tolerance? Has anyone come across it in their work? It's an idea that originated with Daniel Siegel at UCLA. Some of you might have heard of him. We use the window of tolerance in our teaching a lot. And the reason why we use it is because it gives us a really wonderful way to communicate with each other about where we're at. I think this is particularly useful in the workplace, places like here, places like schools, and even I use this at home with my husband because it's my way of saying, you know, I'm here, I'm not dysregulated, I can have that conversation with you. Or if he comes home and says, you know, we really need to talk about how the housework thing's going, and I'm like outside of my window. Now, I can't use it as an excuse. I can't always use it as a way to, you know, not have hard conversations. But at least that, you know, we know that if one or both of us are feeling like we're outside of a window, and it's usually me, that's not the time to have that conversation. Okay? So basically, the window of tolerance works like this. You know, when you're in that state, and it might be fleeting, but you're in that state where you're kind of like, I got this. You know, I'm feeling like if things come at me, you know, I'm able to cope. For me, it's usually earlier in the day before I've had a lot of residue of other daily events. I feel a little bit like I have more spaciousness to deal with, you know, things like traffic. You know, AM traffic's easier, PM traffic is not. So as my day goes on, I notice my window getting smaller. And it can happen in two ways. So one, it could be upregulated. So I'm just like more chippy, more angry. My thoughts are running really fast. I'm more anxious, I'm more agitated. So it's like, you know, leave me alone kind of. And the other might be downregulated. So, you know, those days where you're just, I can't move. I just want to go sit and binge watch something on Netflix. I just can't deal. Or I want to sleep all the time. None of those things, again, are bad. We inherently do what we need to do for a reason. But when it comes to being in a world, in a relationship with other people, it's important to know where we are in our window, because if I had a student come to me and, you know, they were freaking out about their grade and I'm really high up in the agitated, you know, department, that's probably not the good time for them to come and talk to me. Now, if I have no choice, which often happens, right? You can't schedule all your meetings around when you're in your window. At least then I know that I need to be extremely mindful of how I'm being with that person, or say, can you give me 5 minutes and take a break and walk around the building or breathe or something. So it gives me a really good way of knowing where I'm at and evaluating that. But in a workplace environment, and we're doing this in school districts now, we're actually teaching entire districts this concept, so that if a teacher calls on a principal and says, Mr. So-and-so, I'm out of my window of tolerance. I need somebody to come in and just cover my class for 5 minutes. And if you saw what was going on in our schools, this would not be a surprise to you. At least that way they don't feel vulnerable. They don't feel like they're going to their supervisor and saying, you know, I can't cope with this, I can't manage. You know, it doesn't become some personal failure. It's just an acceptable form of language to say, you know what, I'm not in my window right now. Can you give me a couple minutes? I think about med school. I think about when we were in graduate school. I mean, could you imagine going to, you know, just being in clinical supervision and having something difficult and saying, you know what, I just need a second because I think I just went outside my window, versus saying, you know, I'm losing my mind, I can't cope. You know, at least there's language for it. And it's really useful to have language for it. And I think, and you can, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this destigmatizes times when we're out of our stress window. And so, you know, for mental health, I think this is a great tool. I think for, you know, teaching, it's a great tool. So anywhere that you interact with humans, you know, marriages, it's a great tool. But yeah, so this is something that we teach, and people like it and it works. But someone else in your life has to know what it means. So you can't walk out the door and say, I'm outside my window, man. So there's an education factor that needs to happen. So now you and your colleagues know what this means. So back to the relationship sphere. One of the main principles in my book, and one of the main principles I think in life, in my work, is this one mantra: regulate before you communicate. How often do we just make, I mean, this happened to me last week, right before I just came back from one trip and I was getting ready to leave on this one. And, you know, my spouse said something about, we have a puppy, and said something about the puppy, and I just went, and after the fact, I thought, oh, wow, that was really not very nice of me. Of course, he told me it wasn't very nice, but, you know, I'm not perfect. Just because I teach this stuff and just because I study it does not mean that I don't do exactly what I suggest you not do. But what I have learned is that if we regulate before we communicate, it creates a lot more space for us to communicate in a way that I truly believe that just about everybody on this planet genuinely has a good heart and genuinely wants to engage with other people in a way that is kind and respectful. All of us need to be better listeners, I think, with few exceptions. And if we're not regulated, doing that is a lot more difficult. I know some people that operate under a tremendous amount of stress working in health fields that somehow by some act of God, they are able to do all of this stuff. But for most of us humans, we need to practice it. Okay, so one mantra for the day, one core concept is regulate before you communicate. Okay, so you might be wondering, well, how do I do that? And what I get asked often is, well, how do I do that if I'm in the middle of a meeting? How do I do that if I'm with, clinical sessions? You can be all over the place. You can't say to your patient, 30 minutes in, oh, hold on, I need to take 5 minutes to regulate, right? Or if you've got a class of, 40 screaming first graders, you can't say, okay, kids, I'm going to take 5 minutes to regulate. So we need to have tools that we can use now, when you're seeing patients, when you're doing clinical supervision, all of those things, we have to have tools. So here's mine. How many people have not heard about deep breathing? Okay. Deep breathing, the way it is taught in many, many circles, is bogus, okay? If you ask people to take a deep breath, what does it look like? Right? I just took a deep breath, I feel great. Well, here's the thing, and I didn't get into all of this, stuff about the autonomic nervous system. Inhaling is a sympathetic nervous system function. If you're like, you just upregulated. If you breathe out like this, it didn't do a darn thing. And so there's a lot of the taking a deep breath thing. Now, it's not bad, but it's not as effective as it could be. If you lengthen your exhalation is tied to parasympathetic nervous system function. If you successively lengthen your exhalation with each successive breath, that helps to engage the parasympathetic nervous system. It doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen in a fairly short period of time. And the cool thing is, you can do it when you're seeing clients. You can do it when you're in a clinical supervision meeting in grad school. You can do it when you're teaching people. You can do it when you're having meetings with your colleagues. You can do it when you're talking to donors. You can do it whenever you want. The first thing is to be paying attention to your breath, but then you can use this as a tool. And for all the things I've done in my career, this is the number one thing I think is by far the most impactful to the greatest number of people. And it doesn't cost anything. It costs one, interaction with me or interaction with you. But once you learn it, you don't forget it. You just need to practice it. All right. So you want to try it? Okay. So I'm going to invite you, and again, this is an invitation, but I'm going to invite you to be comfortable, but maybe be reasonably, sit up comfortably, but not rigidly. And if you could remove any distraction, maybe for you that might be closing your eyes or looking down or doing something else. And again, if you're not wanting to participate, don't feel obligated. But I'm going to walk you through a few minutes of this, just so that you can have an experience of what this might look like. So take a moment and allow yourself to settle in your seat, whatever that means for you. Notice where you feel yourself connected to your chair. And then slowly begin to bring your attention to your breathing just the way it is. And you might notice, by paying attention to your breath, even that creates a judgment or of value about how you're breathing? Can you hold that judgment or value lightly and focus your attention back on inhaling and exhaling? You can even repeat the word in your head as you inhale, and say exhale as you're exhaling. And notice how it feels to pay attention to your breath. You might even notice other sensations in your body or other stories in your mind starting to percolate up to the surface, and that's okay. Can you gently nudge your attention back to breathing? Now I'm going to invite you to slowly begin to lengthen your out-breath without force or constriction, but can you gently make your exhalation just a tiny bit longer than the previous one? And with each successive breath, making the next exhale just a hair longer. And you may even notice that the quality of your inhalation changes. Can you focus on the out-breath? And we'll do that for a few more moments. And whenever you're ready, you can slowly begin to bring yourself back into this space, blinking your eyes open whenever you like, if they're closed. Welcome back. Any thoughts or experiences that anyone wants to share about that?
I thought it was very effective to tell myself inhale and exhale while I was doing it.
Uh-huh.
I've never done that before.
Uh-huh.
And so being mindful about that and telling myself, it was effective for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're saying you felt that it was effective using the words inhale as you inhaled and exhale as you exhaled. For some people, that's a really wonderful way to focus their attention, because for some of us, and I don't know how it was for you, but sometimes when I'm just focusing on my breath, then I notice like the volume of my thoughts goes up. Like, whoa, okay, I don't think this is what I want to be doing. So for some people, focusing on words, and there are other, things that you can focus on, in, out, whatever, can help to focus the mind a little bit too. Other impressions?
Very relaxing.
Uh-huh.
I almost fell asleep.
And the breath part was about 2 minutes at the most?
It seemed like a lot longer. Like a mini nap.
Yeah. Yeah, I often have people either during or after yawning a lot. So if you're yawning a lot, I don't take it personally. I kind of made you want to yawn more. I'll repeat that for the, so you said it was very relaxing. You felt very relaxed and you almost fell asleep. Yes. So be mindful of where you do this. You do not want to do this in rush hour traffic. I would not recommend it. Or operating heavy machinery, probably not the best time. Other experiences. We're good? Okay. So basically, with practice, that is something that you can use at any time. Now, I preface it by saying with practice because I've had patients come to me and say, oh, I got really stressed out. I tried the breathing thing. I couldn't do the breathing. Well, have you been practicing when you're not stressed out? Oh, I forgot. Okay. When you're hyperventilating, that's not the time to start practicing. I work with a lot of older folks, and a lot of them do it to calm down before they go to bed. Some of them have chronic pain. Some of them are dealing with, anxieties of aging, which there are many. And so they'll practice it before they go to bed, or they'll practice it. I have one who has to take eye drops and then can't lie down for the next 15 minutes. So she actually works on her breathing while her eye drops are doing their thing, and then she goes to bed and she passes out. So the important thing is to do this often. You can do this whenever you want. You don't have to ask for permission, and nobody will even know you're doing it, but it is important to practice it. I started practicing, it's funny, I'm thinking about grad school now, yikes. But I remember starting to do this during stats class. I don't know how many of you did not enjoy stats class, but at least the first, when I started grad school, I had, the classic imposter effect, like, oh, everyone, you're smarter than me, and oh my gosh, this is stats class, and I don't know if I can do stats class. And I would literally feel my heart rate go up, and I would feel my face start to flush. And I thought, wow, if I don't do something, I'm not going to learn a darn thing. And so I would start just slowing down my breathing. The funny part of that story is I knew nothing about this stuff back then. But I knew that if I didn't do something, I was probably going to melt down at some point in stats class. But I survived, and so will you. But so these things can be done anywhere, particularly when we're under really high stress circumstances. It may get you down a notch toward your window. It may not blow the window open by any chance, but it's better than, our nervous systems continuously tend to ramp up. And so it even can intervene and help to break that cycle. So it's really useful. I invite you to try it. Okay. I did not pay you to say that at the beginning, but it was a perfect segue into the next part of this story, which is the mind. And my guess is when your mind starts, thinking a lot, that there's some of this stuff going on. There may not be any of this stuff going on, but most of us get stuck somewhere in what I call the mental suffering top 10. And some of us have different ones, but for a lot of us, worrying and judging and comparing, that whole Facebook, everyone in the world's on a beautiful vacation to Tahiti and I'm here. Anyone do that? Yeah. Guilt and shame and regret, those are big. For those of you in any health profession, you probably either encounter it or have your own. Self-criticism. We're a really good culture of self-critics, in part because I think we have this perfectionistic norm in our culture. I call it the tyranny of the should, right? Like, oh, I should have done that differently, or I should have gotten an A instead of a B, right? And so I have this phrase, stop shoulding all over yourself, because I think we do a lot of shoulding in our culture. Feeling unworthy is fairly common. I put in the imposter effect because I think it is classic in schools. But I also think people that are in, our professions change. We might get a promotion. We might decide to do something different. And there's always that period where, should I be here? Should I really be here? Everyone else is doing this better than me, or whatever, like pick your story. But the point is that our minds are incredibly precocious creatures. And I often have people asking me, when I meditate, am I supposed to shut off my mind? Or when I do yoga, is the whole point of it so that I won't be thinking? No. I have yet to meet a person who can completely shut their mind off. And if they can, I'd like to study them and know how that works. But it probably isn't a really good idea to shut your mind off. But to answer your question, finding some peace of mind is a whole different story. And for some of us, like Margaret said, we need to focus. Sometimes we use words to help channel that energy. For me, words just get my mind going into other things. So I can't use words. I have to focus more on what's going on in my body. So there are various ways of doing this. But ultimately, part of what contributes to our mindlessness is what's going on upstairs. All right, does that make sense? So a big part of what I teach and a big part of what I covered in my book was the fact that we are consummate storytellers and that we are telling ourselves stories all the time. In fact, in the span of time that we've been standing here, you've probably come up with a pretty juicy story about who I am. Maybe, right? See? It's like, oh, she's got brown hair. So she's, okay. Yeah, so we have these great stories. And I bet you a large percentage may not be true. That's why sometimes I get a little weirded out about the bio because, someone reads your bio and people think, oh man, she's such a high achiever. She must walk on water. She probably doesn't sleep and she probably mainlines caffeine, right? No. Or she probably never gets stressed out. No. So yeah, we tell ourselves stories. And we have stories about ourselves, right? Like I'm an introvert. I'll admit it. I'm an introvert. And Jerry and I were talking about this over lunch. Somehow I became an introvert with an extrovert's life. Don't ask me how that happened. I would not have selected it. I got into clinical psychology so I could work with one person or one family. And it was this little contained bubble. And it was beautiful. And somehow 20 years later, I'm spending my life talking in front of huge groups of people. You don't think that stresses me out? Big time, okay? So yeah, I'm not this beautiful extroverted person. I hate to break it to you. But we all have these stories, right? And that is an interesting example for me because if I focus on, oh man, I'm an introvert. I don't want to be doing this. This is way too much. I cause my own stress because I get stuck on that story. If I say, I'm an introvert, I need to manage my life. I took a long walk this morning. Jerry was very gracious and he said, hey, you want to get together this morning? I'm like, nope, I'm going to take a walk for an hour. And then we'll have breakfast, which is what we did. So understanding that I'm an introvert and I need to create space so I can do my extroverted life is a way that I use that story to my advantage. But when I get stuck on the plane like last, oh man, I'm such an introvert and all I'm doing is teaching and I'm just traveling all the time and this is crazy. I make myself really stressed out. So it's important to be mindful of the stories that we're telling ourselves because what we tell ourselves about who we are has a huge bearing on our experience, okay? Conversely, because you all work with people, the stories that we tell ourselves about the people that we're working with, patients, professors, supervisors, colleagues, those stories also have a huge bearing on how we are in the world. So if I have a colleague and I think that colleague is, doesn't like me, right? It's gonna change my behavior. I might be more willing to acquiesce maybe when I shouldn't, or I might be more likely to not talk to them or not do things with them. But whatever story I'm holding in my head about who they are, just like whatever story you were holding in your head about who I am, there's probably a good chance that a lot of it's not accurate, even if you can say, well, I've got lots of experience, man. Like I've worked with this person a long time and this person's not nice. Well, what you might not know is that person's caring for an elderly mother with dementia, has a kid with special needs, is worried about making their mortgage payment. So there's all of this stuff to our story that isn't part of the story. So it's really important to be mindful of our stories, but also because you work with people, the stories that you're telling yourself when someone walks into your office or walks into your clinic room. Because I can tell you as a clinician, before I really was paying attention to this, it would be like, oh, now there's the so-and-so client. Oh, that client always makes my life miserable. And you know what? They did, but part of it was because I told a story about it. So I treated them like they were gonna make my life miserable. But when I realized, oh, wait a minute, what if I'm actually playing out that story more than they are the story? Then I had to back up and say, well, wait a minute, what if I just try to not get sucked into that? And that's really a big part of what it is to be mindful, is to recognize a story, to not beat yourself up for having the story, because we tell stories for a reason. We tell stories because we want the world to be a predictable place. So if everybody I meet, or everyone I work with, I don't have a story, then I'm really defenseless. Like I just don't know how to operate in the world. So those stories have a utility, but it's when we get stuck in them and we can't see evidence to the contrary, that it becomes a problem. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So it's important for us to recognize the story that we tell, or the stories that we tell. I lump them into 3 categories, but they're by no means exclusive, and they're by no means the only type of stories. But the ones I want to focus on are the identity stories, because I think the stories that we tell about ourselves have huge bearing on how we are in the world. My guess in this room is there's a lot of high achiever stories, right? A lot of you guys are like really pushing the envelope, and I mean, you don't get to where you are without working hard, right? So there are a lot of stories around, I'm a hard worker or whatever. Or there are other stories of, I don't work hard enough. But we all have a story about who we are. Like I said, my story is I'm an introvert, and it's a true story, but do I want that story to define my life? Because I'd be literally sitting at home writing books and magazine articles. That would be so cool. That's what I would be doing. But for some reason, I think that the universe decided to throw me out of my little perfect bubble for a reason. I'm not entirely sure I've figured that one out yet. But if I got stuck on, I want to sit and write books and magazine articles, then maybe I would not be living a life that might be what I'm supposed to be doing. So it's important to be paying attention to that. Again, we have stories about people who we meet, so relational stories. And you may not realize this, but we are so attuned to the information that we get back, and it's so easy to take that information and twist it. Like I've been talking now for an hour, and you're probably all, you've been sitting around for an hour. It's like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's not the greatest time of day. So if I see you guys all of a sudden not nodding, kind of looking tired, if my story is, oh, I suck, right? Or, oh, I shouldn't be doing this. I need to go back and just hide in my little box and write my articles. Then I could do that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But the story that I tell myself could also change how I relate to you. So if I'm reading you in a certain way, and that doesn't mean that sometimes what we read isn't valid, but it's important to recognize that that story probably plays into something that I feel about myself a lot more than it plays into what I'm getting back from you, right? So if I inherently think I'm boring, then you could be smiling, nodding, bouncing up and down and cheering, but I'd be like, they're just doing that because they're nice. But I was really boring. So these stories are huge, right? And the last, but not least, and I won't get into this, this is kind of where I'm moving now in my world, is looking at the stories that we have about the world we live in. And more in my work, I'm hearing, via whether it's climate change or you name it, people don't feel safe. And so we are living in a culture where people don't feel safe. They don't feel safe on the planet. They don't feel safe in their homes. They don't feel safe in their schools. They don't feel safe in their buildings. We're building fortresses. We're putting extra security in. We're doing all this stuff, right? But we have a story that the world is inherently unsafe. A lot of people do. And can you imagine what that does to your nervous system? Right? I gotta be vigilant. I gotta make sure no one messes with me. And so I think part of what's going on in our culture, why people are getting more polarized, is we have to hang on to our safe places because we don't want anyone to take them away. We don't want anyone to hurt us or hurt the people we love. And so we have stories, and it's important to recognize that. And again, it doesn't mean they're not true necessarily, but it means that if I'm operating from, I, me, mine, gotta take care of it, survive story, I'm gonna be a very different person than if I don't have that story. Or I'm gonna be a very different person if I don't recognize that story, okay? So again, the stories in and of themselves are not the problem. It is not recognizing the stories that is the problem. So if we're living our lives based on a story that we don't understand, we're more likely to live out that story than we are to challenge it and maybe tweak it a little bit or not. And again, not every story we can change. We can't change big stuff, but we can change what happens in here and how we respond. Does that make sense? Yeah. This is stuff I could go on for days, but fortunately we can't. So I'm going to have you take a moment and write down one short phrase about who you are. We're not going to share them, so don't worry that I'll ask you to share them, but I'm going to just have you take one moment to write down the most salient story about you that you can think of. And then ask yourself the questions underneath that story. So in some respects, this is the work of our lives. And we could literally spend an entire day on this one idea. I often have spent an entire day on this one idea with folks. A lot of our stories come from somewhere else. A lot of our stories come from our family of origin, you know, the good girl, the pretty one, the smart one. The story I tell in my book is the I'm bad at math story. We often get our stories as part of how we are in our sibling relationships. So I had a brother who was a designated math genius and he was older, which made me the designated not math genius. And I was actually fine at math, but I spent so many years telling myself that I was not good at math because he was good at math. And my parents always said, oh, he's the one who's good at math. That I delayed even going to grad school because I saw the math requirements in my area because I started out pre-med. And I thought, that's not going to happen. So I delayed a lot of the choices I made in my life just because of that one story I got, and I was probably 5 years old. Oh, he's the math genius. That means I'm the not math genius. So it's important, I think, to question and look at where do these stories come from, and are they true for you? I'm not a math genius. I never will be. But I'm also not the not math genius. Does that make sense? Did anyone have any, and I apologize, this is the short version of this, but this is the kind of thing that once you start thinking about, wow, is that a story? And what is the story I tell about myself? What is that doing to me? Or what is the story that I tell myself when I sit down with this client or this patient? What does that do to how we relate to each other? All of a sudden, there are a lot of big aha moments. I have people coming back to me saying, wow, that was so profound. And I have other people who have come to me and said, once I started looking at my story, that was heavy. So be mindful of the fact that this is, take it at your own speed and do it at your own comfort. Okay. Oh, the last thing I wanted to mention is I taught a course on all of this stuff that eventually became my book. And the one thing I noticed was that about 95% of people, when we did this exercise, had a negative story. Okay. They focused on something negative as their first story. If that was you, so now you know. If that wasn't you, so now you know. But I started focusing on resiliency stories a lot because if your first story that you landed on was not a positive story, it's important to realize that there are stories you're telling yourself that are super resiliency stories. Like you all have stories that have allowed you to still be here to this day. Those ones often get buried, for some reason. Maybe because we think it's too self-serving to be walking around going, I'm great. I'm just such a great person. I really like myself, right? I mean, I say that and you're kind of like, okay. But we all have these resiliency stories. So just as important as it is to look at the stories that we might want to question, it's important to point to the stories that point to your resiliency, because they are there. And for those of you who work with folks clinically, they're there too. And sometimes our work is to help try to shine a light on those stories, because sometimes they need to be illuminated for others. Yeah. So I'm going to invite you to read this from top to bottom, and then read it from bottom to top, left to right, and then right to left. So this was written by a 10th grader. And I love this because it basically shows that we can all be looking at the same thing and read it and interpret it in entirely different ways. So it's a good reminder that my perception of the story, or my perception of this reality that we're standing in here and right in this minute, is likely very different from yours, but it's just as valid, it's just as relevant. And we're all looking at this story from different perspectives. So it's important to try to examine stories from different angles rather than, once again, getting stuck on a story being a particular way. That makes sense? I love this poem. I think it's cool. All right, last but not least. So we started late. Is it okay if I go a little over? Is that gonna, yeah? Is it okay? Not terribly over? Okay. Okay. Just a little over. So as I mentioned earlier, when we talked about the brain and I showed you the image of the survival and the bottom-up processing, we have amazing science that's being done in this area. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the enteric nervous system and all of the research that's done showing that 90% of the body's serotonin is here and about 50% of the dopamine is here. And that the gut and the heart send more projections up to the brain than the brain sends back to the heart. And when I was trained as a clinical psychologist, I kind of jokingly said we were only trained to deal with people from the neck up because the body just didn't really have any relevance. And now the science is showing the body is a really big deal. And it's important to recognize that what goes on in our bodies also has an effect on our nervous systems. It also has an effect on our brains. It also has an effect on our relationships. And so it's important that we attend to our bodily experience. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole ton of time to unpack this. But often when I work with clients or when I work with groups, we spend a little bit more time paying attention to what's going on in our bodies. Because what's going on here has a tremendous bearing on our psychological experience. For example, if I don't eat breakfast, eventually I start thinking, hunger, 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 hunger. If I drink too much caffeine, which I can't do because I can't tolerate it, but if I did, I would probably just be completely incoherent and babbling. But think about the obvious. Not enough food. Oh, a lot of bad food, over the holidays. You had too much wine the night before. What happens to your mood in your head? So this body that we have, these rental units that we have, that we occupy, are full of information. And again, because we live in this brain-based society, we tend to ignore a lot of that information. I'm happy to see that now there's more recognition of the fact that even in mental health, a lot of what's happening, you know, the obvious, sleep, nutrition, exercise, that when those things aren't on board, we tend to have psychological impacts of that. But what's interesting is that we can use a lot of this information that we have in our bodies to inform the choices that we make. So, and again, it doesn't mean if I come in to work with a stomach ache and I still have to, you know, have 10 meetings, I still have to have 10 meetings. But at least I know that if I'm not feeling well, that where I am in my window of tolerance is probably going to be somewhat compromised, or my window might be closed altogether. So I can communicate, I'm out of my window. Or I can communicate to myself, I may not be in the best frame of mind for this today. And again, you can't necessarily control your schedule, but at least if you go into a meeting and you know, I am like really like here, you can make decisions from those places. You can work on breathing. You can take care of yourself over your lunch hour. You can do something when it's within your agency rather than just keep stumbling along in that place of feeling not so great, okay? I'm gonna explain one concept that comes from the yoga tradition that I think is super useful. It's super useful for those of you working with clients and patients, but it's also super useful for yourself. Generally speaking, the nervous system, when we fold forward, this tends to engage more parasympathetic nervous system stuff. So you just think about it. Like when I'm tired, am I doing this or am I doing this? Right? When I'm stressed out, is my inclination to be more open or is it probably to be a little bit more contained? So something as simple as taking 2 minutes on my desk and just like, and hopefully not falling asleep. There's that, right? But folding forward in any way can help calm the nervous system, okay? Conversely, if we engage in spinal extension, so any kind of back bending, that can help to upregulate the nervous system. So if you are falling asleep, and again, this is not like you're not going to be woo, but you know, even just taking your head, sitting like this, and you know, extending your back can change your nervous system experience. Again, it's not this magic fix, but in altering how we move in space, we can actually change our nervous system experience. It's just a subtle shift, but it actually can work for some people. Now, I teach a lot to people who are dealing with little wee ones in school, and it's really good to help with kids, you know, but we're big kids, right? Like we have the same nervous systems, they're just more developed, and unfortunately probably have more habits that they're working on. But I've got a couple of minutes here. I just wanted to take a moment or two to do another practice, and it could be done in a chair. Let's all do it in a chair so you can see that in my chair at my workspace, I can do stuff, okay? I'm gonna suggest that you back up a little bit from the table so you're not quite so congested. But generally think about it, the principle is, yep. Did you notice that?
I noticed that I was doing what you said, but I hadn't consciously done it.
See, but that's the thing. Like when you wake up in the morning, you go like, and you go, well, depends. Depends on the day. But okay, we'll just play with this for a couple of minutes. So again, please find a comfortable position. Make sure you've got a little bit of wing room. Just a bit of wing room. And if you're comfortable closing your eyes, feel free. Or you can look downward or just soften your gaze. And because we are at this time of day, I'm going to invite you to see what happens if you take the tip of your tongue and just gently rest it at the top of your soft palate, just behind your teeth. So a lot of us jaw grippers, like if you tend to clench your jaw a lot, that can help to unhinge it. And then once again, we'll begin with paying attention to your breath. You don't need to change it unless you would like to, but using your breath as a focal point. then placing your hands on your thighs if they're not there. Slowly slide your hands down your thighs until you're folded forward. Some of you be careful, you have tables in front of you. So you can fold forward as much as you like. You can come all the way down and hug your thighs, whatever feels good on your low back. And as always, if that doesn't feel good, you can also lean forward on your table or whatever is available to you. Now, if you like, you can try lengthening your exhalation in this position. And notice what you observe. Are there any changes you're experiencing? In your body, in your mind. And then slowly come on back up. And then please take your right hand across your left leg and just slowly twist your spine over to the left. Keeping your neck nice and long. And then as you inhale, come back to center. And exhale, we'll twist the opposite way. And as always, if you have any spinal issues, being mindful of this, you can twist smaller or differently. Keeping your neck in line with your spine. Inhale, come back to center. We'll do that again. Exhale, twist to your left. Relax your shoulders. Inhale, come back to center. And twist again to your right. And inhale, come back to center. And then interlace your hands just at the base of your skull, right below your armpit. But keep your elbows not as wide as, maybe a little wider than your shoulders. And then gently holding on to your head so you don't have to use your neck. Inhale and lift your heart up and a little back. Doesn't have to be big. And then exhale, release that. Come forward just a tiny bit. We'll do that again a few more times. Inhale, lifting up, rounding the spine. And then exhale, gently coming back. Breath is important. We'll try that one more time. Inhale, little back bend, we'll hold. Breathe. Notice how the quality of your breath changes as you're in this little back bend. And inhale, come back up. And then exhale, slowly once again, fold forward all the way to wherever is comfortable for you. And if you'd like to lengthen your exhale a little bit more, feel free. And then come on back up when you're ready.
Some people look really sleepy.
Any thoughts? Anyone notice a difference energetically between folding forward and opening back? Yes? So these are really quick 3-minute things that you can do in your chair, at work, between patients, anywhere. Again, I don't recommend twisting while you're driving your car unless you're still looking forward. But yeah, just light alterations of your experience and your breath. So you'll notice I gave you breath cues while you did this. Yeah. So actually it's moving with breathing, but the breathing is really where it's at. Moving is just a nice way to, uncork things. Any thoughts or questions, observations? I know, we're getting close on time. Okay, So a few take-home things to think about for being mindful in relationship to yourself and others. One is pausing. This is probably the hardest part, right? Like, where do I get a pause? I can tell you one of my number one practices in my life for years has been walking my dog. My dog has to be walked. If I leave my phone at home, if I just focus on walking him, dogs are incredibly joyful little guys. And that has been one of my sustaining mindfulness practices, is walking my dog by myself with the little guy. I now have a 16-week-old puppy, so it's a little different than with my older guy. But walking the dog is a practice. That's my pause. That's why I took a walk this morning, because that is so central to keeping me sane that I have to do it. And it's not an add-on to my day. It's a value add, but it is a pause. If you have to walk across from one building to the next, make it. Try not to do this. Try not to like blah, 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 but see if you can make it some time just for you to breathe, just to pause, enjoy the scenery. Apparently this is not a normal day in Oklahoma. Enjoy the not normal day in Oklahoma, but be aware of what's going on around you, because those opportunities are around to pause, but we really have to sometimes work hard to find them. Get to know your window and learn to talk about it. I think it's an incredibly useful tool. I know that in the workplace, it can be a little strange, but if everybody in the workplace is using that language, it can be a little bit less stigmatizing. Use your body and breath-based tools to regulate your nervous system. So now you've learned two. Again, I intentionally taught you quick ones rather than doing nice, long, luxurious practices, which feel wonderful. But sometimes it's those short tools that we really need more. To the best of your ability, think about regulating before you communicate. So if you find yourself out of your window, be aware of it. You may not necessarily be able to change your meeting schedule or when you're seeing patients, but be aware of where you are and try to regulate using your breath. Lifelong exercise of getting to know your stories. I think it's an ongoing proposition. Practice these things regularly. So don't wait until you're in a crisis. Those of you that work with patients, this stuff. You don't tell people, oh, wait till you're in a crisis and then we'll work on suicide prevention skills. No, I mean, you want to work on them now, right? Humor. Watch crazy stand-up comedy at the end of the day. Just find places to embed humor in your life. Find the funny in things, because there's funny in things. It's just try. And try to engage others with kindness, because I think that will be what inevitably helps us to manage our stress in our relationships, is to assume the best that we can of everyone, and try to be kind and realize that we're all doing the best we can, and many of us are suffering, and hold that with some compassion and kindness. So last but not least, resources. So my website has a resource page. You have to hunt for it under more, but it has that breathing exercise we did, but in a longer form. It also has a PDF that has mindfulness resources, tons of them, and videos and books and podcasts and lots of stuff if you want to play with it. I love the calm.com app. If you're not familiar with it, the Calm app is really cool. Insight Timer is also a great app. It's free, I think, still. My book. And even though you're in Oregon or Oklahoma and the weather can be variable, the great outdoors to the best of your ability. Okay? Or not, come to Oregon. We have beautiful outdoors. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up? And these slides are available to you, correct?
We'll post them this
Okay,
afternoon.
cool. So if there's anything you want, that's my, I did not put my contact information on it, but if you want it, I'm happy to give it to you. I love to hear how this stuff lands, or if you have any more questions or want to know anything at a deeper level, I love hearing from you. So.
Is your contact info on your website?
Yes, it is. Yeah, thank you. It is on my website. Yeah, and actually my email address is bgracebullock@me.com. So, and I get lots of emails from people asking questions, so I welcome them. But please be patient with me, because I'm going busy, but I get to you. Yeah. Well, thank you. It was wonderful spending time with you. Appreciate it.
Dr. Ade, could you explain what the assessments are real quick?
Oh, yeah. So we just have these in, and so this is the emotional and social competency inventory. This was developed by Howard Gardner, the one who wrote Emotional Intelligence and Social Intelligence, the faculty member at Harvard. And so he, along with some colleagues of his, they've now licensed this out to Korn Ferry. But this is sort of the brainchild of the originator of emotional intelligence. So it is if you've watched any of the previous sessions, we talked about like the 4 components of emotional intelligence, and they have developed an inventory which you use to self-assess as well as get feedback from others. So if you'll notice in here, the workbook inside has a self-assessment questionnaire as well as a feedback questionnaire. The idea is that you would take the self-assessment questionnaire, and then you have others take feedback questionnaire, because if anyone remembers from our social style, now this is different than social style, but it's probably similar. Maybe the percentages are different, but in social style, about 50% of the time, the way we perceive ourselves is different than the way others perceive us. And so it will be interesting to take this emotional and social competency inventory and have maybe a coworker take it. I would recommend somebody that you work with more so than a spouse or a sibling, because they will be much more objective and see you in what we think, at least in this context, we're presenting this material to help you have better interprofessional workplace relationships. So that's what we're trying to help facilitate. That perspective will probably be a little bit more germane to your interest. But yeah, you're welcome to take these, and